Tonight, Nisanov will introduce to you tonight the speaker.
Welcome, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, we are wonderfully privileged to have with us today a world-acclaimed speaker, a renowned lecturer and facilitator in the field of personal growth and development, Rabbi Label Wolf. Rabbi Wolf is based in Melbourne, Australia. He's a lawyer who holds a master's degree in educational psychology, as well as being an ordained Orthodox rabbi. He's the founder and director of the Human Development Institute and has offices in Australia and the United States. The Institute conducts seminars, retreats, and courses for people of differing backgrounds and spiritual pathways, as well as providing family and personal counseling.
Most welcome. It's really nice to be here with you. I haven't been here for some years. The first occasion was about 7-8 years ago. And I'd like to know, who amongst you have I not met before? Why not? I'm going to speak very slowly because you guys speak funny. We're going to spend a few hours together. You had managed to prepare for that, had you not? I'd say about 12, 1 o'clock would be just fine. I actually use the eyelid test, which is when I see your eyelid drooping, I know that's the time to stop. So you'll give me a cue line when you're ready. Professor Karen Olson is a professor of pediatrics in Case Western University. She had a private patient who suffered from the debilitating effects of an illness known as lupus, the treatment for which leaves severe side effects often, and in the case of a child, as in this instance, it's particularly severe. Before any one administration of the dose of the recommended drug, she asked the child to take a teaspoon of a foul-tasting castor oil, followed by the scent of a beautiful flower, a rose. And this was the procedure on each occasion before the medication was taken. Except that unbeknown to anybody else, she was lowering the dosage progressively until at the end of the course of treatment, she was administering 1/4 of the recommended dose. But the child's body was responding as if a full dose was being given and no side effects. Now, this is a classic case of conditioning, but it's also telling us the power of the mind to affect or trick the body. In fact, some 14, 15 years ago, in Harvard University, they gave a group of students a red pill and told them that it's an amphetamine, it'll speed you up, and a blue pill and told them it's a barbiturate, it'll slow you down. In fact, they switched. 72% of the students behaved according to the belief as to what they were given, quite contrary to the chemistry of the body. In other words, the mind has tremendous power over the body. Professor David Spiegel, again some 12, 13 years ago, took a group of women who were suffering, unfortunately, from cancer and asked them to meet weekly in a non-therapeutic group setting, more in terms of a social get-together. 8 meetings over 8 weeks. And then, in going through the results, 10 years later discovered that that group lived statistically longer than what groups otherwise on the average might in such circumstances. The power of social association, or its reverse, alienation. And the effects of the mind go beyond that. We affect each other at a distance. The more recent research in non-local phenomena. Two people placed rooms apart, wired up to measure the EEG, and told on cue to focus compassion at each other, on each other, to discover that the EEGs overlapped remarkably at those points. Or putting a Qigong master in one room and a subject in another room, and then, again on cue, the Qigong master, through focusing, was able to cause an involuntary backward motion in the subject. Or gardeners who suffer from depression produce less beautiful flowers. And we're talking about double-blind university tests here. Focusing on a test tube at a distance of 1.5 meters can retard or accelerate the growth of an enzyme to a measurable extent. All these and dozens of more recent experimentations indicate, one, the way we interpret reality, our belief system, the way we think, has a profound effect on ourselves, and even more dramatically, although much more subtly, on each other. Therefore, we have ways and means to be able to determine outcomes. And I guess mind-body medicine is one of the recent outgrowths of this. And the research in the area of psychoneuroimmunology, where we're finding that the immune system is depressed through stress and otherwise. What if we were able to change the way we view the world? What if we were able to learn techniques of being able to interpret life differently, creating different emotional outputs? It means that we would have a degree of control on our health and the environment in which we live in. Now I begin in this vein because, as you're getting a sense, I don't teach the teachings of Kabbalah in order to create esoteric, magical cures. I think you know and I know of individuals who spend an hour or two each morning in deep meditative repose, astral projecting, out-of-body experiencing, meeting up with all the angelic wise ones up there, and come back and remain absolutely obnoxious people. In other words, you can be spiritually egocentric. You can be a spiritual eclectic, collecting pieces of data and techniques from all over the place, and yet remain unmoved, unchanged. The way I teach the subject is to try to draw from its wisdoms in order to enable self-change. So if you've come here to learn levitation or other mechanisms of changing the laws of nature, this is an appropriate moment to go home and have a good evening, and I'll take no offense. What I'd like to do is to spend a little bit of time just looking at the way that Kabbalah came onto the scene, a little bit about its historical evolution and its place today, then share with you some of its teachings, specifically as it explains the nature of the human personality, and then take you through a few exercises to show you how you can actually learn to change the way you think and change the way you feel. And that's what I hope to achieve this evening. We'll go for about an hour, have a short intermission, and then follow through, and then that's when I'll apply the eyelid test. Since there's not going to be a formal question-answer period, I'm going to suggest that you raise questions and issues and comments right throughout. Rather than me monologuing from the front, let's have a little bit of a Socratic dialogue and talk to each other so that I can learn from you and your experience at the same time. Okay? Example. Did you know that in the Jewish tradition, it's forbidden to express anger under any circumstances whatsoever without exception? And whenever I say that, my audience immediately gets angry. How can you say that? You've got your master's in psychology, you know nothing about the importance of venting, getting it out of your system, because if you don't, it'll cause untold damage within and splatter you on the walls of your house. At least get hold of a broom and hit the bed 100 times or something. Of course I'm familiar with all that. It's had a very good PR. But I'm also familiar with the much larger, overwhelming evidence that comes to the conclusion that every act of venting is a dress rehearsal for the next occasion. You may have short-term relief, but in the long term, you're really reinforcing a response mechanism, a default response mechanism that continues to become hardened. So can we eliminate an anger posture? Of course we can. If we understand that anger is a manufactured product from raw materials which begin as spiritual flows that become energies within the body, and these energies translate into mind and emotion traits. If we can work at the raw material level, then we can create a response that is equally motivational as is anger, but with none of its ill effects. Anger has no redeeming virtues whatsoever. We know the correlation of angry people and certain illnesses. We know that anger doesn't make for great relationships. We know that anger is an attempt to cower the environment or a person into submission in order that our own particular insecurities and fears can be allayed. There's no great pluses in anger. And I'm only raising it as an example of the kind of conventional thinking that we're raised in and entrapped in. So let's keep that example in front of us as I speak this evening and try to explain how we do produce interpretations and emotions. Well, have I provoked anyone to raise any issues yet, or questions? Or are you all being too gentle and kind with me?
So far.
So far you're being gentle and kind with me. Does anyone have any doubts about that? Good. Do you want to share with me what you think?
It seems to me that God wouldn't have created anger if there was no redeeming value to it. And if somebody is being attacked and you get really angry and it calls up strength for you to go defend them that you might not have had, that can be a positive value.
That's a very good point, don't you think? But there are two different points there. The first point was, God wouldn't have created it, right, if it didn't have some function and purpose. That one I'm a little dicey about, because you might want to say the same about evil, right? If there wasn't any positive virtue to evil, God wouldn't have created it.
Right.
But let's put that one aside. That's a bit philosophical. Let's go to the second one. And that one is, well, surely if you're under attack, anger as a response is quite valid as a self-defense mechanism. You will recall, some of you who study the martial arts, that one of the first things you're told is never get angry. It'll affect the efficacy of your defense mechanism. Or sports competitors in team settings. And I do a lot of lecturing to sports coaches. Know full well and tell their players, don't get angry, because it'll affect your mastery of the game. And I assure you, if God forbid a person is under physical attack, the last thing is that they're angry. There's no time for anger. You go into automatic defense posture. Anger is already an interpretation of the events later on. But anger does not flow in the moment. But again, we can look at those things sometimes when we're in a workshop and we can actually simulate them. You may want to test it out. And I assure you, you're never angry if you're under attack. You may be angry later as an interpretation of the events. Any other thoughts? Yes?
Anger seems to me more of a subjective act. In other words, it's something you do yourself.
Mm-hmm.
It really never is an outside obligation.
Mm-hmm.
Something happens to you that is angering you. You're really angering yourself.
Okay, I share your view. I think anger is the way that you produce that particular emotional flow. All right, so we've got a little bit of a discussion going. Why don't we just pause it and move into the subject matter and come back then to reinterpret the discussion, because I'm only using this as an example. Now, someone here in the audience has been forcibly nominated to operate that machine there. You are it.
Yes, I'm not even angry about it.
See? It's only been 10 minutes and it's already worked. Okay. So what I'll do, I'll just give you a little signal when I wanted to move on. Like that. Thank you. Abraham Maslow was a humanistic psychologist of the 60s and 70s. And he said something which I think is very important for us. If you set out to be less than what you're capable of being, I warn you, you'll be deeply unhappy for the rest of your life. Each person seated in this room is unlike any person who ever lived, any person who is alive, or any person who will live. Each one of us is absolutely individual because we possess an individual soul, which means that each one of us is gifted like no other person, and that's where self-esteem and self-worth derives from. The same soul is reincarnated many times over in a different body in order to ensure that the eternal agenda of that soul is completed. But at any one point in time, only that soul can become a co-creator of the unfinished universe. And therefore each one should push our boundaries, meaning we should recognize our individual giftedness and ensure that the lifetime affords us an opportunity to actually contribute what no one else can. And I think that's inherent in Maslow. A precondition, however, to be able to do that successfully is humility. And this statement from Albert Einstein, I think, is a good example of humility. I feel like a small child playing with shells on the edge of a vast sea. The Jewish teaching of humility is unlike what we seem to sense in the West. Who is the paradigm of humility in the Jewish tradition? It's Moses. Now, isn't it remarkable? Moses, general, president, chief justice, arbiter of all Jewish disputes. That is the paradigm of humility. When we have a sense of humility, we talk about self-effacement, turning the other cheek, etc. But that's not a Jewish teaching. The Midrash tells us why indeed Moses is the paradigm of humility. The Midrash says, if Moses were asked, "Hey Moshe, how come you're such a great guy?" he would have said, "Me, a great guy?" If someone else were given the same gifts that God gave me, they would have done an even better job. Humility is to recognize those gifts that we spoke about a few moments ago, that each one of us possesses, but we have to be assertive in conferring them. We're not allowed to hold back. The humility is the recognition they're not of our making. But it's false humility if they're not conferred. Therefore, in our tradition, humility goes hand in hand with assertiveness. That's somewhat different. My teacher and master, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, said, "Great things is not what's demanded of our generation. The previous generations did all that for us. We need only do the small things, but in a more difficult time. For us, self-sacrifice could mean nothing more than a simple change of habit. But breaking habits is not so simple. In our tradition, the way that we create self-change is from the outside in. In other words, lying prone in parallel position on a couch and paying someone hourly in order to do that and to speak out our woes in order to discover why we are the way we are is not the most desirable way to create change. It's true, it's interesting to discover why we are the way we are, but it's not going to help the next person or yourself tomorrow. The way to change tomorrow is to speak differently and behave differently. And in our therapeutic approach, if you do speak differently and behave differently, you change the climate within. It's what's perhaps is called today the behavioral approach. And that's very important because we're going to emphasize today behaviors, the externals. I run a self-mastery course in Melbourne, in Australia, where I live, over 5 weeks. And over those 5 weeks, I give my participants, amongst others, this following exercise. I tell them, for the next week, you must not initiate any conversation or respond to anybody under any circumstances until 3 seconds have elapsed. Try for 2 minutes and you'll see how hard it is. The following week, reduce the 3 seconds to 2 seconds. 3rd week, reduce it to 1 second. 4th week, half a second. Final week, merest semblance of pause. And the participants come back and tell me that their lives are absolutely transformed by this one exercise alone. Why? Because if you understand some of what I'm going to share with you now, what it is that's going on to create the thought process, what it is that's taking place to create the emotions, and use the spiritual tools to be able to change that and give yourself the space in order to begin that process, what is going to come out of your mouth and what is going to be exhibited through the body is going to be very, very different. So let's have a look at some of these tools. But why not first discover what is this tradition that I'm sharing with you? Because so far, I've hardly used the word Kabbalah. And yet, I assure you, everything that I've said, although it seems to be couched in psychological terms and conventional terms, is latent in what I'm going to share with you. In the Chumash, in the Torah, the Jewish Bible, it states that Abraham sent away his sons whom he had through his second wife, Hagar, or otherwise known as Keturah. I prefer to have them on, Rabbi. I've got to see the whites of their eyes. Okay. he sent these sons le'eretz kedem, to the land of the east. You look at the commentaries, and you'll find that some of these define the land of the east as Hodu, India. He sends these sons to India, and the verse goes on and states that he provides these sons, before they leave, with matanot, gifts. And what are these gifts? Spiritual insights to the higher realms. Armed with these gifts, the sons go to India. Now Abraham, as you will recall, is nicknamed Avraham HaIvri, Abraham the Hebrew. Now what's the word Ivri, or Hebrew, mean? It comes from the root Aver, which means the other side. He was nicknamed the other sider, the outsider. Why? For two reasons at least. One, he was the first monotheist in the highly polytheistic society of Mesopotamia, which didn't endear him to the local folk, and they called him the outsider. He also came from the wrong side of the tracks, from across the Euphrates River. And again he was called the other sider. And that's what the word Ivri means, the word Hebrew means. When you look in Indian literature, there is talk of a wisdom that came from another area, brought by sons, a wisdom that was so much held in respect that they named a river after the father who sent the sons. The name of the river is the Indus River. And in Indian, Indus means the other sider, the outsider. Not only that, they name a deity after the father. The name of the deity, Brahman. And Brahman is of course simply a rearrangement of the letters Abraham. Or you find that the suffix of Abraham's first name, Avram, Ram, in the East means high God, and in Hebrew means elevated, high. Or one of the grandsons who's mentioned expressly in the Chumash, in the Torah, as having gone there, Ashurim. Ashurim is credited with having begun the ashrams. Or the Indian word for spiritual impurity is tamas, and in Hebrew it's tameh. Or the Veda literature and poetry is etymologically linked to the Hebrew verb yodea, da'at, insight, knowledge, and onwards. You find at a terminological level some amazing parallels. More interestingly, at a conceptual level. Ideas such as karma and bardo that have entered the Western lexicon are long-honored Jewish teachings. The idea that there's a cause and effect relationship between lifetimes already alluded to in the concept of Gilgul HaNefesh, the cycle of the soul, and onwards. So you find these kind of parallels there. There's something else I'd like to introduce. This was for the purpose of explaining that many of the teachings in the various spiritual traditions you will find have overlap. And they all testify to a common beginning. When I met with the Dalai Lama not long ago, and we were discussing some of this, at one stage he asked me to share with him a Jewish teaching. So I started to teach one of the 10 Sefirot that I'm going to teach with you, the one of Chesed, which ultimately is our giving nature and produces the disposition of compassion. So as soon as he heard the word compassion, he said, "Hold on, that's one of mine." And I said, "Yes, and now you know where you got it from." And fortunately, he has a sense of humor. The Torah has 4 levels. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai, he taught the Torah at 4 levels. The first level, called Pshat, is the plain meaning of the teachings. The second level, which he taught to a more limited group called Remez, which literally means hint, means that level of allusion. For example, if I were to be, God forbid, the bearer of sad news to somebody, I wouldn't just blurt it out. I try to prepare the emotional climate by hinting at the information. Similarly, there's a level of teaching which is at the level of hint. Then there's a third and deeper level that Moses taught to an even more limited grouping there, and that's called drush. And drush is that third level where if I were to find it so difficult to try to teach a subject of complexity and difficulty, maybe the only way I could get the idea across is to hide it in an analogy, in an allegory, in a metaphor. So the Midrash, if you were to read it, seems to be like a collection of quaint, simple stories. But rest assured that beneath there lies immense depth. And then Moses taught a very small select grouping, the fourth and the then deepest level of the Torah, known as the Sod level. Sod literally means secret. This is the level associated with Kabbalah. So the first thing to note is that Kabbalah is a level of understanding the Torah. It doesn't hang five there as an independent spiritual approach that somehow is in murky waters connected loosely to something Jewish in the past, but it's really entrenched. And to study Kabbalah is to study the Torah. Now, throughout history, it was a hidden tradition. However, the Rebbe teaches that just as human beings and plants have genetic codes, and therefore different parts of the body have growth spurts as you move from infancy through childhood, through teenagehood, etc., so is time endowed with a genetic code. And certain things occur in history, not because of sociological cause and effect relationships or historical impinging of events upon events, but because they were destined through a genetic spiritual process to occur. And I'm going to share one with you. You know the Zohar, which is the main work of Kabbalah. And here's another really major error in all the textbooks, or nearly all the textbooks, where they say the Zohar was created in the 1300s. That's not true at all. It was already reduced to written form more than a millennium earlier, in the 200s, by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And that was on the basis of an oral tradition going back to Mount Sinai at the level of Sod, a further 1700 years. So we're talking about something much older than its first publication date, true enough, in the 1300s, in the person of Rabbi Moshe de Leon, where the textbooks usually start. It really has gone thousands of years prior to that. At any rate, the Zohar is not a book of prediction, not like Nostradamus. Yet, it makes one very specific prediction and gives a date for it. Let me paraphrase what it says. It says, a time will come when the fountains of knowledge will burst open from above and below. And at that point you'll have to access your inner wisdoms in order to maintain balance. And a date is given when this is to occur. And when you look at the parallel secular date, you find the following events took place. 1, the Industrial Revolution. 2, the beginning of scientific method. 3, the rise of nascent nationalism, ultimately culminating in the French Revolution. 4, the rise of Puritanism in England. 5, the rise of Hasidism. All these events burst onto the scene in a very short spectrum of time, exactly correlating to what the Zohar had predicted. And from then on, we've never been the same. The world's never been the same. That's when modernity arose. And that's where change started to happen in geometric progression. And you and I are the heirs of that change. And that's why we suffer. Because we're living in a time where the rate of change is so prolific that it's very difficult for the human mind to cope and assimilate it. Hence confusion. And certainly today, we have a complicating factor of technology and specifically the media. Today, you and I have our minds and hearts basically enslaved by the projections of that commercially exploitative media. We're being told how to think, how to feel, how to dress, how to eat, and we're losing our sense of personal confidence to the point of sense of self. Hence, insecurity and fear are the primary response postures that you and I exemplify. Fear, insecurity are the most powerful features of our life. And if you ask me which program on television is most at fault, I would say it's the program where most people settle down at the end of the day as a family called the evening news. I know of no program where all the negative images of the world are tightly scripted and packaged to hold our attention, because fear rivets our attention as a mechanism to ensure us being there when the soap and the cars are being sold. Now, how do we respond to that? There's two possibilities. You can do what I did 27 years ago, and that's throw away the television set. But I'm realistic enough to know that's not going to be a majority attitude. On the other hand, we can also do something which I think is real, and that is to develop a strength of self, a self-mastery, so that we can measure the changes around us, interpret them in a healthy way, which will produce health within, and also create positive change without. Now, within the Kabbalistic teachings, I think there is one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, set of tools to achieve that. And let me share some of these with you. We learn that the cosmos consists of 4 parallel spiritual realms. These 4 realms, Asiya, Yetzirah, Bria, and Atzilut, are the product of the Ein Sof. The word Ein Sof literally translates without end or infinity. It's the Kabbalistic metaphor for the Creator. Now, these realms are basically timeless and spaceless except for one, and that's the realm of Asiya down here. The realm of Asiya is the only one where time and space exists. It's the realm of human consciousness. It's where our existential meaning in life derives from. It's where you and I are basically happy or sad through the course of life or year or day. The realm of Yetzirah, which coexists with it, no longer has any time or space. But it's physical compared to the one of Bria, which is physical compared to the one of Atzilut, etc. Okay, so this is the stage upon which you and I act in ways that I'm going to now describe. Through these realms flow 10 qualities or energies called Sephirot, of which you see 3 here. These Sephirot, as they transcend through these realms, ultimately manifest down here, and there's no real down or up, it's all relative, but let's call it down here, as mind and emotion. 3 Sephirot of mind and 7 Sephirot of emotion. Of course, it means that up here and up there you have unembodied mind and unembodied emotion. concepts which may be difficult to contend with in the shortness of time, so I'm going to limit our discussion to down here. These three are called Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at. And tonight I'll explain shortly one of them as an example. But together they make up the whole nature of our human intellectual functioning at a spiritual level, ultimately through the physiology of the brain becoming manifest as mind activity. Then we have three more of internalized emotion called Chesed, Gevura, and Tiferet. These are the emotions within, or the three basic ones. And then finally, we have four more, which are the way in which mind and emotion relate together to produce the products that ultimately manifest in the thought, in the speech, and in the external behavior. I've just gone through 15 chapters of a work known as the Tanya, which is the work that I personally recommend as the most useful study to understand the teachings of Kabbalah. I'm not an advocate at all of the study of Kabbalah. In fact, I think it's a real waste of time of studying the Kabbalistic writings. Not because it doesn't contain wisdom, obviously it contains immense wisdom, but couched in a language that's basically foreign, or more significantly, encoded and encrypted deliberately to prevent access. It's a very poor resource if you want to gain wisdom to contend with life today. But fortunately, as I said earlier, with the rise of the Hasidic movement, at that point in time, as the Zohar predicted, Hasidism took the teachings of Kabbalah and made them intelligible. And now many of these have been translated. And as I say, in the Tanya, is a very valuable resource. And I know that there's this idea that goes around and says, you shouldn't study Kabbalah until you're 40 years of age, got your PhD in Talmud, and become a man, which makes it somewhat difficult for women. Well, it's true that once upon a time, for the majority of time, it was sound advice not to dabble in it. The reason is that Judaism is a very grounded approach to life. We have always been exhorted to deal with the here and now, to deal with the mundane and ordinary, not to fly high. Because by doing the ordinary things of life is how we become effective co-creators of that unfinished universe. In fact, that's in one of the basic Kabbalistic teachings. Have you heard of the Sefer HaYetzirah, which is translated as the Book of Formation or Creation? The earliest Kabbalistic book in existence, attributed to Abraham, which predates Moses by some 700, 800 years. That makes it the oldest textual rendition of Kabbalah. Let me just teach you a little phrase from there. It says there, the end is wedged in the beginning, and the beginning is wedged in the end. You read that and you say, wow, that's deep. And I haven't got the faintest idea what it means. So let's look at some of the articulation of that teaching. What does it mean, the end is wedged in the beginning, and the beginning is wedged in the end? Well, one night, an architect wakes up and has an inspiration for a design. Next day, the architect takes his or her draftspersons and they begin the process of planning. And when the plans are refined to an extent, they're submitted to a town planning permit committee, are they not? And then, of course, the committee rejects the plans 3 or 4 times just to justify its existence. And then, in the name of progress, ultimately passes some version, which may not be the best one anyway. And then you and I, walking past the construction site at the end of 9-10 months, looking at the beauty of the building, by peering at that, we have some sense of what must have been that moment of inspiration in the mind of the architect that night, 10 months earlier. Whereas that architect, 10 months earlier, in that very flash of illumination, in that creative process, had a fully fledged vision of the end product. The end is wedged in the beginning, and the beginning is wedged in the end. One night God couldn't sleep, woke up with an inspiration, said, let's create a world. Next time frame, God took its drafts angels, and they began the process of drafting a blueprint. The Midrash calls the Torah a blueprint of creation. And then the Midrash tells us that even God has to submit his plans to the local angelic town planning permit committee. And guess what? They don't like it. We have a stenographic rendition of the proceedings in the Midrash. The angels say, God, you must be kidding. You're going to create a world which is ordinary, finite, physical, and mundane, with human beings who are going to despoil it, bring evil into existence. Stick with us, we're a better bet. You know, God has a way of pushing plans through town planning permit committees, and we get to construction. 7 days of construction. And what do we end up with? An ordinary, mundane world which you and I, specifically I, keep messing up. However, if the end is wedged in the beginning, and the beginning is wedged in the end, we know that which comes last must have been foremost as intent. And that's why in the Jewish tradition, working in the mundane and ordinary is where we should be at. However, because of that genetic time spurt of growth, leading us and propelling us into the complexity of today, the masters have indicated that that kind of prohibition is no longer there, and have in fact asked everybody to be involved in the process of studying the deeper teachings to contend with the deeper confusion of today. And women, the Lubavitcher Rebbe said, specifically so. Because he said women are part and parcel of the economic climate of the world today, and they still have primary responsibility in nurturing the next generation. How much more wisdom should women accumulate in order to engage that process? So, hence, we all involve ourselves in the study of these deeper teachings. So that is the basic array of who we are. Okay? But who are we really? So let's have a look at this. This is who we really are. What you have here is all the 10 Sefirot coalesced into a form, a channel, which we call the Neshama, or the soul. In our tradition, therefore, the soul isn't some pinpoint within, but the soul is a spiritual umbilical cord. One end is located in the Ein Sof, the infinite source, and the other end is located in each one of us here in the room. In other words, everyone has his or her independent spiritual umbilical cord. And the combination and permutation of the Sefirot here is individualized. Therefore, each soul has its own spiritual personality. And that's why no two people are ever alike. And this is a very, very important teaching, because what it really tells us is something else. We are here, and we are here, and we are there, and we're right up there. Our consciousness is along here. Our subconsciousness, as Western psychology might say, or our collective unconsciousness, as the Jungians might say, or, as we say, the neshama flows through the higher realms. It's all the same teaching. And some people are gifted to be able to recognize themselves higher up on the spiritual umbilical cord, and that's called altered states by some. And in our tradition, many of the masters at will were able to generate that, like the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, would often quite openly speak about the phenomenon called Aliyas HaNeshama, elevation of the soul, which means consciousness at a higher level, and describe what in fact are the spiritual dynamics happening there. Or you can open up the book of Ezekiel, Sefer Yecheskel, and you'll find the prophet there talking about the dynamics, which we call the angelic forces in these higher realms. But please be aware that what the prophet is talking about there is not reality. It's the way that the prophet could perceive that reality and to translate that infinity into the words of here and now. So if you visit France and go to Paris and visit the Louvre and see these beautiful big canvases of cherubic figures with wings, they got it wrong. These are not angels at all. These are cherubs, kruvim. What are angels? The Hebrew word is malach, which got translated correctly by the Greeks in the Septuagint as angelos, which means messenger. Spiritual cause and effect relationships that happen here as a consequence of what God does up there and what you and I do here. With our thoughts, with our words, with our behaviors, we create malachim, angels. There's also godly created angels. And the kind of cause and effect relationship is the way that we leave a residual of ourselves in the cosmos. I said earlier how now we're discovering scientifically how we affect each other at a distance, which happens all the time. Why is it sometimes you enter a room and you meet someone for the very first time and you're immediately repelled by that person or attracted to that person? Your angels are talking to each other. The auras are intersecting. Just another way of saying exactly the same thing. And it's very important because we've learned in the Hasidic tradition, for example, there's a wonderful work known as Likutei Diburim by the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, where in the opening chapters he talks about how thoughts project and are effective across to the other side of the globe. And you and I have that capacity. So imagine how the atmosphere of the home, how the setting of the relationship is subtly affected by all these various angelic forces that you and I keep creating around us and keep carrying around us. At any rate, that is basically the model from which we're going to speak of changing self. I'm going to pause for a moment to see if there are any questions about that model. 1, 2. The gentleman first, yes?
Well, before you brought up the sense of angels, I'm kind of feeling this part of being at the level of consciousness and then up to the Sof, which would be Godhead, that would be
Yes.
the beginning of God, the infinite. And seeing that umbilicus as maybe expanding and not being so direct, and that being the thought that I had. You know, if you come in and you see somebody and you feel like you've sensed them before and maybe know them, maybe that's that expansion into those deeper levels. But now I'm getting the sense that maybe that expansion is in fact those angels.
Okay. Stay with that. What you're really saying is impressionistic interpretation of my pictures. And they're only my pictures, they're not reality. So perhaps you'll understand a little better of what I want to convey when I start dissecting this shortly into individual components. And then we'll understand what really is recognition and thought, which is what you're talking about. Have you been to Israel?
No.
Those of us who have been to Israel, would you recognize what this particular gesture means? It means rega, which is a way of saying, hold on, be patient, we're going to get there. Okay, so, right, any others? This lady here, yes?
In the previous slide, you spoke of 3 components to the emotion, or three main emotions
Three main emotions, okay, yes.
Could you say what those are?
Chesed, Gevurah, and Tiferet, which of course doesn't mean anything. So I am going to identify one of these much more specifically soon by way of example, because at the moment they're just words. I agree with you.
You can't just interpret it as sadness, joy, or anything.
No, these are already the manufactured products. I'm talking about what creates the sadness, what creates the happiness. I'm talking at the level beneath what becomes expressed. Then it's easy to find its expression. That's why I keep saying, going back to the example of anger, anger is already the expression. But what if we change the dynamics that led to it? That would be wonderful. Yes?
From this point of view, what happens to what we consider consciousness or reality as we move
Okay.
through?
What is consciousness and reality in context of this model? You know, the world is made up of a duality. Everything comes in twos. Have you noticed? Look at ourselves. 2 hands, 2 eyes, 2 feet, 2 nostrils, 2 hemispheres of the brain. And look how we perceive reality. Up and down, left and right, positive, negative, particle, wave, proton, electron, binary system, yin and yang. It goes on. Everything comes in twos. Now, we've known that for a long time. In fact, ever since we received the Torah. What's the first letter of the whole Bible?
Bet.
The Hebrew letter Bet. And that is the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Tell me, if you were writing the world's bestseller, would you not have allowed yourself a little bit of poetic license and begun this major work for the sake of symbolism with the first letter of the alphabet? And the divine author seems to choose the second one. But of course, everything is a teaching. It teaches us the following. The value of the second letter is 2. Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, Gimel is 3. It teaches us that the human perception of reality is forever going to be in dual mode. What's the primary motivation of life? What makes us move on and on and on? Taking all the twos of life and attempting to create ones. And how's that best expressed? Love. Love is 2 people trying to bridge the chasm of differentness, merging closer and closer together, sometimes experiencing the peak experience of oneness, only perforce to separate again, because nothing can be maintained in a state of oneness. It's the Hasidic teaching of Ratzu Vashur, ebb and flow, everything is cyclic. Only to try to come back and create oneness again. Or study, learning. What's learning? What's study? It's taking the information, which is separate from a person, and internalizing it. You can only say you know something when you and the information are absolutely one. Then you know it. Isn't it interesting that in the beginning of the Torah, when we speak about the relationship between Adam and Eve, it says, and Adam knew Eve. Adam yoda es Chava. Now come on. Why is the Torah being so coy? Speaking to an adult audience, why wasn't it explicit and said, Adam had sexual intercourse with Chava? Because sexual union is not ultimate unity. It's an aspect. But really, for 2 to become one, love is much more than a physical act. It's much more than a feeling. In fact, ultimately, love is only validated through behavior. And especially when a person puts himself or herself out for the next person, to be uncomfortable because you love the other person. So the primary motivation of human endeavor is oneness, coming together, taking the twos of life and making them one. Another duality, coming now specifically to your question, is higher order self and lower order self, Nefesh Elokit and Nefesh Bahamit. The Nefesh Bahamit is our ego self, that part of us that drives towards food, clothing and shelter. There's nothing wrong with driving towards food and clothing and shelter. We have to survive. The problem with the lower order self is it doesn't know when to stop. How much food? How much clothing? How much shelter? For some, eating has to be an experience of haute cuisine every night. Nothing less will suffice. Clothing means you have to have only designer label. Shelter, you have to have a chandelier in every room, including the toilet. In other words, the self-ingratiation which the ego self propels is onwards. It never ends. Unless we then switch and allow our higher order self, which is called the second soul system of the Nefesh Elokit, the selfless self, to take over and say, hold on, enough, now let's move into a life of purpose and meaning. Okay? That duality is constantly in warlike state with each other. Part of us wants to enjoy the pleasures of life, and another part of us says there are higher pleasures than the mundane, ordinary ones. So as we move higher up in consciousness, we become much more unified because the Nefesh Elokit resolves the duality, and we move into a position of sometimes an altered state, sometimes a state within the world where we actually have a peak experience. And also I will discuss with you, but not right now, altered states which are manufactured, whether they be through hypnosis or whether it be through meditative experience or what else, in order to be able to experience ourselves higher up in the spiritual realm. One more question and then we'll go further. All right, two more questions. Yes?
So shouldn't there be the word ego instead of consciousness in your diagram?
Should the world be?
Shouldn't it be ego instead of consciousness in time, space, ego instead of time, space, consciousness?
These dualities take place all along the line. All I'm saying is that ultimately, down here, on this plane, we have to war within. We have to work hard at creating that mastery principle. Example. A man is seated in a train. I'm going to stop in about 5 minutes. A man is seated in a train, reading a newspaper, deeply engrossed in the financial pages, as men are wont to do. At the next station, a father and 3 children get into the same carriage, and the children immediately begin to jump up and down, yell, scream, and our newspaper reader is getting more and more agitated, more and more angry. And it's welling up within him until he can't contain himself any longer, and he gets up, walks over to the father and says, "Can't you control your kids?" And the father blinks and he says, "I'm really sorry. You see, my wife died this morning, and I'm not sure what's happening." And our newspaper reader shifts. "What can I do for you?" Starts to play with the children. Same raw data, same provocation, total reinterpretation. Immediate shift from the ego self to the higher order self. And when I speak shortly about the sphere of Chokhmah, I'm going to talk about how each one of us can create that paradigm shift of interpretation through the spiritual flow of one of these sephirot known as Chokhmah. And then we'll understand the ego self a bit more.
You mentioned when you first started speaking on the slides that the soul, we're all individuals.
Yes.
There was no one like us in the past. There will be no one like us in the future. But then you also mentioned about the reincarnation of the soul to be nurtured through life. how does that fit in with us being there's no one like me in the past and no one like me in the future?
Because
my soul comes back.
even if when your soul does come back, it comes back in a different body, with different parents, with different children, with different environment, with different genetics. And therefore, in terms of functionality in this world, it's a completely different obstacle course. You aren't the same person. The soul is the same. But the test of that same soul is to be able to hurdle in this obstacle course differently. Okay, 2 more slides. So let me, before we break, show you an example. Otherwise you'll sort of leave and get up and be very frustrated by everything that I've said. Chochmah. You and I go fishing in the pond of subconsciousness. We have our own individual fishing style. We have our own favorite fishing reel. We always have our choice bait. And we always go fishing in that area of the pond where we feel most comfortable and secure. The result is, we always catch the same fish. We always think the same thoughts. In fact, the contemporary writer has noted that we have 100,000 thoughts a day. The tragedy? 95,000 are identical every day. We're boring. We're predictable. We're like Pavlov's dogs, responding right on cue. She comes in, has that look on her face, and I immediately see red. My boss comes in and gives me that instruction every morning, and I get really upset. Every morning, 5 days a week, for the whole of my working life. How boring. What if we were able to learn to change our Chochmah profile? What if we were able to give birth to positive and creative thoughts, improving on a daily basis, widening the amplitude and range of creativity and the depth of inspiration? What if we were able to spend a day workshop where I would be able to give you certain exercises, questionnaires, simulate circumstances, and you could actually identify a pattern in your default response mechanisms of the way that your mind interprets. That's what Chochmah is. Chochmah is the way that we move from a position of subconsciousness to consciousness. Chochmah is the spiritual flow that allows us to give birth to thoughts. It's probably the most important moment that ultimately gives birth to emotions, because our emotions are always the product of our interpretation. Now, if you were to learn about mind and emotion in the Zohar, once again, I want to show you what a waste of time it would be. You'd come across the following statement. And Chochmah implanted its seed in the womb of Binah, resulting in conception, gestation, and the birth of 7 children, the 7 emotions. That's it. That's what you would read. But you'd have no idea of the mechanics and dynamics involved that can create tools so you can actually achieve these changes within yourself. Because they're latent within. You'd have to be a sufficiently long student for years in order to draw the implications by learning it with one of the adepts. Okay, so let me go through just a little exercise telling you how you can change your Chochmah profile. Just a glimpse of it. So one little exercise before we pause. I'd like you to do as follows. I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to conjure up in the mind a positive image. An image which may be familial, or it may be a natural landscape, something that has a nice positive connotation for you. Spend a little time there. Identify the feeling that you're experiencing. Just recognize it. Become aware of that feeling. Now give 2 or 3 words of description, verbal description to that feeling. Translate that feeling into 2 or 3 words. Verbalize it in your mind. Recognize the city of Chelm as the city from which all Jewish jokes come from. But in Chelm there's a remarkable therapist. And this couple who's had marriage difficulties seeks out his counsel. And he begins and says, you know, 20 years ago, when we first got married, life was absolutely bliss. I used to come home from a hard day's work, and there was my wife, standing on the porch, smiling, slippers in hand, and my dog used to come, barking gaily, wagging its tail. And now, 20 years later, I come back from that same hard day's work, and there's my wife standing on the porch, barking. And the dog is chewing on the slippers. So the therapist scratches his head and says, but I don't see the problem. After all, you're still getting the same service. And I have a sense that what distinguishes this place, where I'm a visitor here in this Chabad house, is the fact that the rabbi and rebbetzin are members of the Chabad movement, rabbis and rebbetzins, plural, and they're distinguished by their service. Some of you may not know the kind of sacrifices that they have had to undertake to come here and stay here, like having their children living away from them for their educational needs, because those particular needs are not in close proximity to town. But because they do belong to the Chabad movement, which always espouses the notion of love and responsibility, they're here with us. And I think it's a great tribute to them that this building is here and the services take place here. And I think it's full credit to them that in fact we have such wonderful service. Thank you very much. Can we lower the lighting in the side? Half lighting. That's right. And now the machine will not work unless we turn the power on. And that's the teaching for all of us. We have to plug in. Okay. Next slide. Meditation. Ken Wilber, who's the father of the transpersonal movement, says TM simply assumes that things will straighten themselves out somehow once a relaxed state is induced. What you often get is very relaxed neurotics. As I said earlier, it's not a cure-all. Sometimes it masks things rather than brings things to the consciousness. The Lubavitcher Rebbe said, words from the heart into the heart. Meaning, without emotion, you don't really penetrate the veneer of the other. Merely talking at the person doesn't in any way connect. You have to have the empathy, the warmth, the other-centeredness that derives from the Nefesh Elokit in order to reach that connectedness. And to do that, the first of the Chabad Rebbe's taught the words Moach Shalit al Halev, which translates, the mind must shape the emotions. Mind is compass, direction. Heart is energy. Both are necessary. It makes no sense for us to emulate Rodin's sculpture of the thinker on the rock, forever sitting there, never moving, intellectualizing, cogitating, but not in any way expressing. On the other hand, emotional scatterbrain expression creates pain and hurt. You've met probably, as I have, individuals who, in the space of the first 2 minutes of our meeting, have shared with us already all the most intimate details of their life. Very, very sharing, and very, very unwise. In other words, wisdom has to shape emotions. You have to have the compass, and you have to have the energy, and we have to blend them together. Sometimes it requires a leap of faith. But I think faith is rational in the following way. Let me tell you a story. A man sold his house and bought a horse. And all his neighbors came to him and said, "You mean you sold a whole house and bought a single horse?" And he said to them, "You don't know. Wait and see." The next day, the horse ran away. And they came and laughed at him. And he said to them, "You don't know. Wait and see." And the following day, the horse came back with 9 other horses following it. So they came to him and said, "You're indeed a wise man." And he said to them, "You don't know. Wait and see." He tells his oldest son to break the horses in. The son falls off and breaks his leg. So they all come and poke fun at him. And he says to them, "You don't know. Wait and see." The following week, his country wages war with its neighbor. All the young men are conscripted. Many die, except his son, who has a broken leg. So they come to him and say, "You're indeed a wise man." And he says to them, "You don't know. Wait and see." And the story is endless. People, we simply don't know. Any seeming adversity has a 50-50 statistical probability of ultimately being for our good or for our harm. And since we don't know, it makes a lot of sense to blindly opt for a faith position of optimism, because there's some very fine byproducts, like I mentioned earlier, health, and people like to be in the presence of optimistic people, relationship. And there's a 50 percentile probability that you're right. So why do we always opt for the other 50 percentile? Why do we respond with fear? Because we lack the courage to express that faith. A faith that's perfectly logical. To do that, we need emotion drive. So let me share with you another one of the 10 Sephirot, but this time talking about an emotion. Chesed. I mentioned it earlier to you. What is chesed? Chesed is that spiritual facility within that ultimately expresses in the emotion of giving, sharing, contributing, anything that's outward. In fact, if I were to best to describe this, I'll probably adopt this posture. Anything which radiates outwards from us. Wide-angled activity. A samurai warrior had to be trained to become aware and conscious in a 360-degree circumference. Wide-angled activity. Pouring out. Let me contrast it with one that I'm not going to discuss tonight, the next emotion of Gevura. Gevura is that spiritual capacity, that flow of the 10 Sefirot that allows us to do this. Withhold, contain, limit, focus, anything which is narrow-angled activity. Someone practicing karate has to take the dispersed energies of the body and concentrate them, focus them in a very narrow, tight beam so that the hand can break the stone. That's highly concentrated, a Gevura orientation. All our emotions are the product of a balance of these two, our outward tendency and our inward tendency. Neither of these is good, neither of these is bad. Wisdom is required to create the propriety of the balance. Mind has to shape the emotions. I'll give you an example. My wife taught our 7 children to make their beds each morning. Some of them now are grown up and have their own children and use the same method. It's called the star on the chart system. You make your bed, you get a star on the chart. However, at the turn of the millennium, that's not a very exciting, motivating activity anymore. So we build in another layer of motivation. When you collect 7 stars, you have an outing to your favorite place, which is called Toys R Us. Now we're thoroughly modern. So when our youngest, who today is 12, had his first outing to Toys R Us, my wife said to him, Yisraeli, you can choose one gift from this aisle over here. So as he ambled across towards the trolleys, what do you call them? Carts. We had our suspicions. But then as he systematically emptied the shelf into the cart, we realized there was a miscommunication. And my wife said, Yisraeli, no. The deal was one gift and one gift only. In that moment, Gevura was in ascendancy over Chesed. Yet no one in this room doubts the wisdom of that. So how we appropriate these two equal and opposite emotional tendencies through the intermediary of mind creates wise emotions, or Chachma, Bina and Da'at already impinging over Chesed, Gevura and Tiferet, which I haven't obviously explained the full gamut of through a lack of time. But you're getting a sense of how we actually coalesce this spiritual vortex of flows, spiritual flows, into a shape that is concretized by decision-making, exercise of choice. Exercise of choice is the greatest mystery of creation. It's what makes us human. If we didn't have the capacity to choose, we would not be human. Without the capacity of free choice, we would be reduced to being robotic automatons, acting in an enslaved manner. But to be absolutely free, we have to have the freedom to choose badly. Otherwise, it's not real. So for whatever reason, which is part of the mystery, God created a world where evil exists. In our system, the evil is not out there. There's no independent force of evil. In our tradition, Satan, is definitely not a competitor to God. Satan is an angel acting on God's instructions implicitly. Satan is the angel to test us. In other words, evil is the product of poor human exercise of choice. And that's where meaning of life comes from, where we and how we exercise choice, which again comes from the duality within the ego self, nefesh bahamit, and nefesh elokit, and how we actually allow the 10 sephirot to flow either by an act of choice and will through our lower order self or through our higher order self. That's what creates the choice. So chesed is that tendency which we have to share of ourselves. The truth is, it's the most dominant creative force in the cosmos. Of the 10, chesed is the one that Hashem ultimately implanted with greatest vigor in creation. So you look at the first verse of the Bible and you read the first commentary of Rashi, and Rashi commentates and notes that Hashem used midat harachamim, the flow of compassion, which is an outgrowth of chesed, in order to allow the world to be compassionate. And that's why we feel so good when we connect through love. And that's why we feel so fulfilled in an act of compassion. Think about the last 2 weeks. Think of a moment when you felt intensely happy. And think of another moment when, God forbid, you felt upset. 2 things. I guarantee both relate to a relationship, and the intense happiness will be all about giving in a state of relationship, in the broader sense of the word, and the other one will be disconnecting or withholding inappropriately. If we have time, I'd love us to discuss that one feature alone, because it would contribute so much to our understanding of what creates happiness and sadness. Okay, let's stay with chesed a little longer. So chesed is to arouse the giving self. How do we actually implant it? So I'm going to do a little exercise which perhaps is a little strange with you. What I'm going to do is as follows. I'd like everyone to reach into their pocket or into their purse and take out a coin or a dollar note and hold it in their hand. Okay, and shortly someone will be around to collect it.
Somebody's going to come here and collect it.
Okay. As you're holding it, I want you to become seriously aware